"Your wife is alive," said the poor girl. These words changed his life. No one knew who she was, but her eyes carried secrets that only a great love could reveal. She appeared and disappeared like a shadow, leaving clues in notes, coordinates, and forgotten memories. And while the world doubted her, he discovered that the key to finding his wife again was in the hands of those they least expected. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The silence in the executive office seemed eternal among the piles of unsigned documents and the framed portrait that had occupied the same place on the mahogany desk for 3 years. Edward Mitchell adjusted his tie for the 10th time that morning, observing through the panoramic window the frantic movement on Fifth Avenue. At 52, he commanded one of the largest communication conglomerates in the country, but his life had transformed into a mechanical sequence of protocol commitments since Helen had been declared dead in that terrible accident. The secretary knocked discreetly on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Mitchell, the charity event starts in an hour. The driver is already waiting." Edward nodded without taking his eyes off the photograph. Helen smiled in that image, her brown hair captured by the wind during a trip to the Catskills. It was the last photo they had taken together, 2 weeks before the accident that changed everything. The Children's Support Institute occupied a modest building in Chinatown. Edward crossed the main hall greeting authorities and businessmen with the cold cordiality he had perfected in recent years. His presence there was more of a social obligation than an act of genuine generosity. He discoursed on social responsibility, signed a hefty check, and posed for the usual photographs, all executed with the precision of someone who had transformed life into a theatrical performance. When he was finally heading toward the exit, something made him stop. Perhaps it was the crystalline laughter of a child coming from the inner courtyard, or the golden afternoon light filtering through the windows, but Edward felt an inexplicable impulse. He dismissed the driver and decided to walk through the neighborhood streets, something he hadn't done in years. The narrow sidewalks teemed with life. Haitian merchants organized their merchandise, the aroma of home-cooked food escaped from family restaurants, and children played between fruit stands. Edward walked without destination, allowing himself for the first time in a very long time to simply exist without an agenda or corporate purpose. It was in a small plaza, surrounded by century-old trees, that he saw her, a girl of approximately 8 years old, straight black hair cut in bangs, sitting alone on a wooden bench. She was drawing something in a worn notebook, completely absorbed in her creation. There was something in her posture, a premature melancholy that touched Edward in an unexpected way. "May I see your drawing?" he asked, sitting cautiously on the bench beside her. The girl raised her eyes. They were dark, deep, filled with a wisdom that didn't match her age. For a moment she seemed to evaluate him with the natural distrust of someone who had learned early not to trust strangers. "It's a family," she finally said, showing him the paper. Edward observed the simple drawing, 2 adult figures holding hands, surrounded by colorful flowers. "My aunt said that every family has secrets, but good secrets are like hidden flowers. One day they appear again." "Your aunt seems very wise," Edward commented, feeling a tightness in his chest. "What's her name?" The girl hesitated, flipping through the pages of her notebook until finding another drawing. This one showed a woman with long hair taking care of several children in a spacious room. "She doesn't want me to say her name. She says it's dangerous, but I can tell you something." The girl looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "She knows the song you used to sing to your wife when she couldn't sleep." Edward's world seemed to stop. His hands trembled imperceptibly. "What song?" "That lullaby about the little bird that always comes back home. She said you made up the lyrics on a rainy night when your wife was worried about a nightmare." The girl softly hummed a melody that Edward recognized immediately. It was impossible. Absolutely impossible that anyone would know about that. Where is your aunt now?" Edward's voice came out hoarse, laden with an emotion he couldn't control. "She comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She teaches the shelter children to read and draw, but she always leaves when she sees strange people arriving." The girl closed the notebook and stood up. "She said if I met a sad man who carries a photo in his shirt pocket, I should give this to him." From inside the notebook, the girl removed a yellowed envelope. With trembling hands, Edward opened it. Inside was a paper with handwriting he would recognize anywhere in the world, even after 3 years. The little bird never forgot the way home. It was just learning to fly higher. Look in the place where children draw the future. Edward felt his legs weaken. The paper had Helen's subtle perfume, that wildflower scent she always wore. When did she give this to you? Last week. She said it was important, that I needed to deliver it at the right time. The girl smiled for the first time. You're him, aren't you? The man in the photo? Edward nodded, unable to speak. He removed from his shirt's inner pocket the photograph he always carried with him. Helen smiling in the Catskills. The girl observed attentively and nodded, as if an important mission had been accomplished. The shelter is on Palm Street, number 423. But she won't appear if there are strange people around. She's very smart. The girl began to walk away, but turned one last time. My name is Isabella. She said you'd want to know. Edward remained alone in the plaza, holding the note that changed everything. The certainties built over 3 years crumbled like sandcastles. Helen was alive. It wasn't a desperate fantasy of an inconsolable widower, but a fact supported by intimate details that only she could know. The lullaby, the perfume, the handwriting, everything was real, tangible, impossible to forge. The sun was beginning to set when Edward finally moved. He kept the note in his inner pocket next to the photograph and walked slowly back to the civilization of skyscrapers and executive commitments. But something fundamental had changed in that seemingly casual encounter. The armor of indifference he had built was beginning to show cracks, and through these fissures infiltrated a possibility he hadn't dared to consider. Helen wasn't just alive, but had found a way to communicate with him. Night fell over New York, while Edward mentally retraced each word from Isabella, each detail of the drawing, each nuance of that encounter that seemed orchestrated by a superior intelligence. Tomorrow he would begin a journey that could either restore his life or definitively destroy the illusions that still kept him standing. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten what it was called: hope. Edward woke before the alarm, as had happened every morning since his encounter with Isabella. It was 5 in the morning, and the city still slept under the blanket of the New York fog. He had spent the night mentally reviewing each word from the girl, each detail that confirmed the impossible. Helen was alive. For 3 years, he had religiously visited the tomb where she supposedly rested, depositing white flowers and whispering promises that now seemed directed at emptiness. He dressed discreetly, dark jeans, cotton shirt, cap, and left without telling anyone. The shelter on Palm Street was in a humble region of the North Side, far from the upscale neighborhoods where his life took place. Edward parked 3 blocks away, walking through the still deserted streets until spotting the 2-story building with a facade painted light yellow. Hope Institute read an unpretentious sign at the entrance. Edward observed from afar, hidden behind a parked van, studying the routine of the place. At 7 in the morning, the first children began to arrive, some accompanied by adults, others alone. He immediately recognized Isabella among them, carrying the same colorful backpack and drawing notebook. For 2 hours, Edward kept vigil. Staff came and went. Parents picked up children, but no sign of Helen. He was about to give up when a woman of approximately 40, black hair tied in a bun, approached the side entrance of the building. She carried a bag of school supplies and walked with the naturalness of someone who knew that environment well. "Good morning, Teacher Mary," shouted one of the children from the window. The woman waved and disappeared into the building. Edward made a mental note. Tuesday, 8:15 in the morning, exactly as Isabella had said. Back at the office, Edward locked himself in his room and did something he hadn't personally done in years: a meticulous investigation. He began with the accident files. The official report described a head-on collision on I-87, car in flames, unrecognizable charred body. The identification had been made through the vehicle plate and personal items found at the scene. Edward leafed through the pages with growing discomfort. Something was wrong, but he needed specialized help to detect the inconsistencies. He called Mark Adams, a private investigator who had provided discreet services to the conglomerate in previous delicate situations. "Mark, I need you to review an accident report from 3 years ago. Discreetly, very discreetly." Edward's voice carried an urgency that the investigator immediately picked up on. "Sure, Edward. Can you send me the material?" I prefer you come to get it. And Mark, this can't leak to anyone, literally no one. 2 hours later, Mark was in Edward's office, meticulously analyzing each page of the process. He was a 50-year-old man, former civil police officer who had specialized in complex corporate cases. His trained eyes scanned the documents with the precision of a surgeon. Edward, there are several irregularities here. Mark pointed to a date in the upper corner of the page. The medical examiner who signed this report wasn't on duty the day of the accident. I verified with the hospital. He was on vacation in Europe. Edward felt his heart accelerate. Continue. The scene photographs show burns consistent with accelerant, not common in simple automobile accidents. And look at this. Mark showed an attached sheet. The fire department report mentions they arrived at the scene 40 minutes after being called. For an accident with a fatal victim, that's excessive time. What does this mean? That someone wanted to ensure there were no survivors, or that there was nothing to survive. Mark closed the folder. Edward, I need to ask, do you have reasons to believe Helen is still alive? Edward hesitated. Telling about Isabella meant exposing the girl to possible dangers. I have indications. I need absolute certainty before making any decision. I understand. I'll investigate more deeply, but this will take a few days. Meanwhile, be extremely careful. If someone forged your wife's death, they certainly had powerful reasons for it. After Mark's departure, Edward returned to the shelter. This time he arrived earlier and positioned himself strategically in a nearby cafe, from where he could observe without being noticed. At 2 in the afternoon, the same black-haired woman exited through the side door, but this time Edward was able to see her more clearly. His heart almost stopped. The bone structure, the way of walking, the way she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Everything was familiar, very familiar, but the hair was different, shorter and darker. There was a small scar on her forehead that hadn't existed before. Edward instinctively stood up, but the woman had already turned the corner. He followed her at a distance, always keeping at least 50 meters between them. She walked through various streets, occasionally stopping at pharmacies and stationery stores, always attentive to her surroundings. Edward noticed that she mastered basic counter-surveillance techniques, sudden changes of direction, strategic stops at shop windows to observe reflections, use of crowds to mask movements. The pursuit ended at a subway station where she disappeared among rush-hour passengers. Edward remained standing on the platform, frustrated but at the same time more convinced than ever. That woman knew Helen intimately, or was Helen herself? Back at the office, he found Mark waiting with new discoveries. Edward, I got some explosive information. The car your wife supposedly drove was purchased with cash 3 days before the accident, through an intermediary I couldn't trace. Helen's original vehicle was found 15 days later, abandoned in a parking lot at LaGuardia Airport. This means that someone meticulously staged her death. The question is, who had an interest in this? And more importantly, was Helen a victim or an accomplice? Edward leaned back in his armchair, processing the information. Mark, I need you to investigate something else. 3 years ago, was there any strange movement in the group's companies? Suspicious contracts, questionable partnerships, anything that could compromise Helen if she knew about it? I'll check. But Edward, if we're right, your wife discovered something that forced her to disappear. And people who forge fatal accidents don't usually give up easily when their secrets are threatened. That night, Edward dined alone in his apartment, as he had for 3 years. But this time, it wasn't just loneliness he felt. It was a complex mixture of hope, fear and determination. He removed Helen's note from his pocket and read it once more. The little bird never forgot the way home. It was just learning to fly higher. He was beginning to understand that Helen hadn't just disappeared. She had reinvented herself, assumed a new identity, found a way to continue living while remaining officially dead. But why? What had she discovered that forced her to make such a drastic decision? Edward spent the night awake, chronologically organizing all the events of the last months before the accident. Meetings that Helen had mentioned as strange, contracts that worried her, telephone conversations she interrupted when he arrived. Pieces of a puzzle that finally began to fit together, revealing a much darker scenario than he had imagined. Edward arrived at the office the next morning determined to dig deeper. The sleepless night had brought him clarity about where to look. Helen had always been meticulous with documents. If she had discovered something compromising about the group's companies, She certainly had kept evidence somewhere safe. The first place he investigated was Helen's personal safe, sealed since her death. With trembling hands, he typed the combination that she thought was secret. The date of their first date, followed by the number of the house where she grew up. The safe opened, revealing jewelry, personal documents, and at the bottom, a black folder that Edward had never seen before. Inside the folder, he discovered copies of contracts, printed emails, handwritten notes, and photographs. Everything related to a project he knew nothing about. The construction of 3 shopping malls in the metropolitan region, financed through an intricate network of shell companies. The documents showed systematic over-invoicing, use of inferior quality materials than specified, and more seriously, connections with businessmen known for questionable practices. "My God," murmured Edward, recognizing the signature of Robert Castle, his executive vice president and trusted man for more than 15 years. The contracts showed that Robert had created a parallel structure within the conglomerate, diverting resources and establishing partnerships that seriously compromised the company's reputation. The phone rang, interrupting his analysis. It was Mark. "Edward, I need to see you urgently. I discovered something that changes everything." An hour later, Mark was in the office with a somber expression. "I investigated the financial movement of recent years and found a worrying pattern. In the 6 months prior to Helen's accident, there were significant transfers to offshore accounts, all authorized by Robert Castle. $50 million, Edward read in the documents Mark had brought. Robert was systematically diverting money from the group. And there's more. I managed to track some of these accounts. The money was used to finance real estate ventures through companies that officially have no connection with your group. But in practice, Robert controlled everything." Edward felt a growing nausea. "Helen discovered this." "Certainly. And from the documents you showed me, she was meticulously collecting evidence. If she had exposed Robert, he would face not only financial ruin, but probably criminal proceedings. That's why she disappeared," Edward concluded, the pieces finally fitting together. Robert discovered that she knew everything. He staged the accident to eliminate her before she could denounce him. But Helen anticipated it. Something alerted her to the imminent danger, and she managed to escape. The question is, where is she now, and why hasn't she returned yet? At that moment, the secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Castle requests an urgent meeting. He says it's about strategic group matters." Edward and Mark exchanged significant glances. "Schedule it for 3 in the afternoon," Edward replied, "and ask him to come alone." At exactly 3 o'clock, Robert Castle entered the office with his usual confident posture. At 48, he was an elegant man, with articulate speech and calculated smiles. For 15 years, Edward had considered him like a younger brother, entrusting him with crucial decisions and important corporate secrets. "Edward, my friend, you look worried. Is there something I can help with?" Robert sat comfortably in the leather armchair, crossing his legs naturally. "Actually, there is something I'd like to discuss with you." Edward opened the folder he had found in Helen's safe. "Can you explain these contracts to me?" The change in Robert's expression was almost imperceptible, but Edward, who had known him for so long, noticed the momentary tension around his eyes. "Ah, these are the real estate projects in the metropolitan region. Strategic investments that we approved in the board 2 years ago." "Strange. I don't remember approving shell companies or a 40% over-invoicing in construction materials." Robert laughed nervously. "Edward, you've been very stressed lately. Perhaps you should take a vacation, rest a bit. I can take on more responsibilities here at the company while you recover, like you took on in the last 3 years. Edward placed on the table the bank statements that Mark had obtained. 50 million transferred to offshore accounts, all with your authorization. The silence that followed was dense, charged with tension. Robert rose slowly, walking to the window. When he turned, all the mask of camaraderie had disappeared. "Edward, you don't understand how the business world works. You've always been too idealistic, too naive. While you worried about social responsibility and corporate ethics, I kept this company competitive in the real market." "Does the real market include stealing 50 million and faking my wife's death?" Robert smiled coldly. "Helen was too intelligent for her own good. She was gathering evidence, preparing a complaint that would destroy not just me, but the entire group. You would lose everything, Edward. Everything we built together. So you decided to eliminate her. I decided to protect our interests. But your wife proved smarter than I imagined. She managed to escape before we could definitively resolve the situation. Edward felt a cold anger taking over his body. You didn't just steal. You destroyed my life, made me believe Helen was dead for 3 years. And it worked perfectly until now. You became an absent leader. I took operational control and everyone was satisfied. But now you're asking inconvenient questions. Robert sat back down, assuming a business posture. I have a proposal. You pretend you never discovered anything. I gradually return the diverted money and we continue running the business normally. In exchange, I guarantee that Helen will remain, let's say, officially deceased. And if I refuse? The board of directors is concerned about your recent emotional instability. There are conversations about your capacity to lead the group. A vote of no confidence would be very embarrassing, don't you think? Edward understood that Robert had carefully orchestrated the entire situation. For 3 years, while he took refuge in mourning, his vice president had built a network of influence that now threatened his own control over the company. I need time to think. Of course, but not too much time, Edward. Situations like this tend to resolve quickly one way or another. Robert stood up, adjusted his suit and walked toward the door. Oh, and avoid making more unnecessary investigations. Some secrets are too dangerous to be revealed. When he was alone, Edward sat heavily in his armchair. The magnitude of the betrayal was beginning to become clear. Robert hadn't just stolen money. He had systematically destroyed his personal life to maintain control over the company. And Helen, his dear Helen, was alive somewhere, probably still running, still hiding from the threat that Robert represented. Edward picked up the phone and dialed Mark. I need to find her, Mark. I need to find Helen before Robert takes some more drastic measure, and I need to gather enough evidence to completely destroy him. Edward, this could be very dangerous. If Robert was capable of staging a fatal accident, we don't know how far he might go to keep his secrets protected. I don't care about the risk. Helen is alive, Mark, and I'm going to bring her back whatever it costs. Edward spent the next 3 days immersed in a frantic investigation. With Mark's help, he managed to trace the origin of the diverted money and discover the real extent of the criminal network Robert had built. It wasn't just 50 million. Over 5 years, the vice president had diverted more than $200 million through a complex web of shell companies and over-invoiced contracts. But the most shocking discovery came when Edward revisited Helen's portrait that he kept on his desk. Moved by an inexplicable intuition, he examined the frame more carefully and found, almost invisible on the back part, a small device he had never noticed. It was a microscopic memory chip, skillfully disguised as part of the frame's decoration. Helen was always cautious, murmured Edward, inserting the chip into his computer. What he found there left him breathless. Recordings of conversations between Robert and his partners, compromising emails, photographs of secret meetings, and mainly, a detailed diary where Helen documented each discovery about the corruption within the group. Edward read the last entry in the diary, dated 2 days before the supposed accident. If you're reading this, it means my worst fears have been confirmed. Robert discovered that I knew everything and is planning something terrible. I can no longer pretend ignorance, but I also can't expose him without putting you at mortal risk. I'm going to temporarily disappear until I find a safe way to bring the truth to light. I love you more than life itself, and I promise we'll find a way to be together again. Edward felt tears roll down his face. Helen had sacrificed herself to protect him, assuming a false identity and living underground, to keep alive the hope of one day being able to definitively defeat Robert. At that moment, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello? Edward. The voice was whispered, almost inaudible, but he recognized it immediately. It was Helen. My God, Helen, where are you? I discovered everything about Robert, about the money, about... I know you discovered it, that's why I'm calling. But we need to be very careful. Robert has dangerous contacts, people who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate us to keep the secrets protected. Where can we meet? Helen hesitated. Do you remember the waterfall where you asked me to marry you, on the Hudson Valley Road? Of course I remember. I'll be there tomorrow at noon. Come alone, Edward. And be very careful. I'm sure Robert sent someone to watch you. The call ended, leaving Edward in a mixture of euphoria and dread. Helen was alive, wanted to see him, but the danger was real and imminent. He spent the night organizing all the evidence he had collected, making copies and leaving detailed instructions for Mark about what to do if something happened to him. The next morning, Edward left home before dawn, driving on secondary roads toward the mountains. He took all possible precautions, changed cars twice, made unnecessary detours, used basic counter-surveillance techniques that Mark had taught him. He couldn't allow Robert to discover the meeting location. The waterfall was on an abandoned private property, surrounded by preserved forest. Edward and Helen had discovered that place during a hike 15 years earlier, and it had become their secret refuge for special moments. It was there that Edward had asked Helen to marry him on a golden autumn afternoon that remained vivid in his memory. Edward arrived 15 minutes early, parking the car on a secondary trail and walking the last 500 meters to the waterfall. The sound of water falling on rocks and the birdsong created a natural symphony that dramatically contrasted with the tension he felt. At exactly noon, she appeared. Edward saw her before she noticed him, walking cautiously along the trail, constantly looking back to verify she wasn't being followed. Helen had changed a lot. She was thinner, her hair short and dyed black. Small wrinkles around her eyes demonstrated the stress of the last 3 years. But she was still the most beautiful woman Edward had ever seen. "Helen!" His voice echoed through the clearing. She turned, and for a moment both were paralyzed, simply looking at each other across the distance that separated them. Then Helen ran toward him, and Edward embraced her with a strength that tried to compensate for 3 years of absence. "You're really here," Helen cried against his chest. "So many times I dreamed of this moment, but I was also afraid it might never happen. Why didn't you reach out to me before? Why did you let me believe you were dead?" Edward moved slightly away to look into her eyes. "Because Robert has contacts everywhere, Edward. People who work for him in the police, in the judiciary, even among our close friends. If I appeared, he would eliminate me definitively, and you would be next." Helen then told him the whole truth. How she discovered Robert's diversions by chance, when reviewing routine contracts. How she spent months secretly collecting evidence. How Robert discovered her investigations and threatened her directly, giving her 24 hours to forget everything she had seen or face the consequences. "I managed to escape the night before the supposed accident. Robert had already prepared everything. The car, the body that would be planted at the scene, the forged report. But a hospital nurse, Marie Sanders, alerted me about the plan. She overheard Robert talking with the medical examiner about how the false identification would be done. And you hid all this time. Marie helped me get false documents. I assumed the identity of Mary Smith and began working in shelters and charitable institutions. It was a way to keep myself busy and at the same time help children who were also helpless like me." Edward held Helen's hands, feeling the reality of the moment. "I have all the evidence, Helen. Everything you collected plus much more. We can expose Robert today. And then what? He has expensive lawyers, influential contacts. He might manage to get rid of the accusations and still take measures against us. Not if I resign control of the company and make the whole scheme public. The press, authorities, public opinion, everyone will know the truth." Helen looked at him with concern. "This means losing everything you've built. What I built without you is worth nothing, Helen. These 3 years taught me that success without love is just an empty illusion." At that moment, they heard the sound of cars approaching on the road. Edward and Helen looked at each other, immediately recognizing the danger. "Robert found out," Helen whispered. "Come, I know a trail that leads to the other side of the mountain." Edward took Helen's hand and they began running through the woods, hearing behind them the voices of men organizing a search. The escape lasted 2 hours. Edward and Helen ran through old trails, crossed streams, hid behind rocks and century-old trees. It was as if the years of separation had disappeared. They moved in perfect synchrony, mutually anticipating, united by a common purpose. They finally reached a secondary road where Mark was waiting with a car, according to the emergency plan Edward had established. "Mark, how did you know where we were?" "I tracked your cell phone when I realized you were in danger." Robert mobilized at least 10 men to find you. During the trip back to New York, Edward and Helen finalized their plan. The next morning, Edward would call a press conference to reveal the whole truth about Robert's diversions and about the fake accident that had kept Helen in hiding for 3 years. He would present all the evidence, resign from command of the company, and turn the case over to the competent authorities. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Helen asked. Once we make everything public, there will be no turning back. Helen, I spent 3 years dead inside, pretending to live while the only thing that gave meaning to my existence had supposedly disappeared. If recovering you means losing a company, then to hell with the company. The press conference happened 2 days later in the conglomerate's main auditorium. Edward methodically presented all the evidence of Robert's scheme, the diversions, the shell companies, the fraudulent contracts, the plan to eliminate Helen. When he finished his presentation, he called Helen to the stage. I would like to introduce you to someone you know as dead for 3 years, but who is actually the true heroine of this story. My wife, Helen Mitchell. The impact was immediate. The room exploded in flashes and questions from journalists. Helen, with a courage that Edward deeply admired, told her version of the facts, explaining how she had discovered the corruption and how she had been forced to disappear to save her own life. Robert was arrested that same day, along with several of his accomplices. The investigations revealed an even broader scheme than Edward and Helen had imagined, involving dozens of companies and hundreds of millions of dollars. 6 months later, Edward and Helen were sitting on the porch of a simple house in Vermont, observing the sunset over the mountains. They had sold all unnecessary possessions, donated most of their fortune to charitable institutions, and chosen a simple life, far from the spotlight and corporate pressures. Do you regret it? Helen asked, holding Edward's hand. Regret what? Trading $1 billion company for the woman I love, choosing truth instead of convenience, finally being able to sleep peacefully at night. Edward smiled. The only thing I regret is having taken so long to find you. Helen moved closer and kissed him softly. The little bird finally found its way home. And this time, Edward replied, embracing her in his arms, it will never fly alone again. From that simple porch, surrounded only by the silence of nature and the certainty that they had chosen love above anything else, Edward and Helen built a new life, a life where wealth was measured in shared moments, where success was simply waking up every day next to the loved one, and where the only ambition that mattered was to be happy. And they were. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that Edward and Helen's story has touched you deeply. This journey of love, betrayal, courage, and redemption reminds us that life's most important values are priceless. To continue this emotional experience, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here, clicking to your left. If this narrative awakened emotions in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the transformative power of true love. Don't miss our next content and tell us in the comments, do you believe love can overcome any obstacle? We await you in the next story.